So for those of you who just arrived, we've been listening to Philip Glass's string quartet, Mishima, performed by the Grove String Quartet, formed of current and former graduate students at the Fred Fox School of Music. So now that I hope you are refreshed, we'll go on to the main event. Myron Magnet, the former editor of City Journal, and now the magazine's editor-at-large, is the author of books on topics ranging from Charles Dickens to social policy. Those might be intertwined, by the way. From the American founding to constitutional jurisprudence. His latest work, Clarence Thomas and the Lost Constitution, won praise from former U.S. Attorney General Michael Mukasey as a great read, fascinating and provocative. And columnist Michael Goodwin judged it brilliant. Former President George W. told the Wall Street Journal that Magnet's The Dream and the Nightmare, the 60s legacy to the underclass, was, after the Bible, the most important book that he'd ever read. And White House advisor Karl Rove called it a roadmap to the president's compassionate conservatism. The work he'll discuss today, The Founders at Home, the Building of America, 1735 to 1817, is, according to historian Richard Brookhiser, beautiful, entertaining, and inspiring. And fellow historian Thomas Fleming judged it superb, a pleasure to read. A PhD from Columbia University, where he taught, Magnet was a staff writer for Fortune magazine before he took the helm of City Journal. In addition to his many City Journal and Fortune articles, Magnet has written for the Wall Street Journal, the National Review, the New York Times, and the New Criterion, where he is this year's visiting critic. In 2008, President Bush awarded him the National Humanities Medal. One would normally say, let us greet Dr. Magnet. Well, I'll say it, let's greet Dr. Magnet, even though you're muted. Dr. Magnet, you're on. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Dan. It is such a pleasure to be with you. And thank you all for joining me virtually, though we are celebrating something very, very real today and very much worth celebrating. I wrote The Founders at Home because I wanted to know not just what the Founding Fathers did, but what they thought they were doing. What kind of republic did they envision as they declared independence, fought the Revolutionary War, drafted the Constitution, and set the new government going? So I told the story as a series of biographies. I read not only the chronicles of events, but also the founders' letters and diaries, articles and speeches that take us from the 1735 Zenger libel trial, which first proclaimed the idea of inalienable American rights to free speech and a free press, right up to the end of James Madison's presidency in 1817. Part of what impelled me was the sense that we were losing our reverence for the ideals and values these extraordinary men sought to embody in their truly revolutionary new nation, one formed by reflection and choice, as Alexander Hamilton said, rather than by accident and force. But if I worried then, now in the very few years since I wrote the book, our culture is in furious, if benighted, revolt against the founders, branding them as ignoble and vandalizing their statues, since I came to believe that the American founding is one of the greatest achievements of the Western Enlightenment. I thought that you might find a crisp summation of the worldview behind it interesting and thought-provoking, especially in light of current events unfolding on this 233rd anniversary of the signing of the Constitution that framed the new government. The strongest of the three greatest founding ideas was a thirst for individual liberty. For the founders, liberty was not some vague abstraction. They understood it concretely as people do who've suffered its opposite. They grasped it like those Eastern Europeans who once lived under communist tyranny, for instance, or like Jews who escaped the Holocaust. Remember that the Plymouth Pilgrims were only the first of many who came to the New World to escape religious persecution. Hard as it is to believe today, British law once forbade non-Anglican Protestants from worshiping freely, and it barred them from the great universities and from political office. In response, thousands of Congregationalists, Presbyterians, Baptists, Quakers, and others fled across the sea. They brought with them their dissenting tradition of governing their own congregations and hiring and firing their own ministers. In other words, they brought to these shores a political culture of self-government. Moreover, because they were accustomed to reading the Bible and feeling free to judge its meaning for themselves, to believing that they had a direct relation to God and His Word, independent of any worldly institution or authority, they also brought a deeply rooted culture of individualism and personal responsibility. For them, the individual and his conscience, his freedom of thought and belief, were of preeminent importance. William Livingston, a signer of the Constitution and longtime governor of New Jersey, reminded readers of the journal he ran in the 1750s, a journal that was key in turning the American mind toward revolution, how the countless sufferings of your pious predecessors for liberty of conscience and the right of private judgment drove them to this country, then a dreary waste and barren desert. His own Presbyterian grandfather was among them. John Jay, our first Chief Justice, wrote a gripping account of how his grandfather, a French Protestant, returned home from a foreign trading voyage to find his family and neighbors gone. Their houses were occupied by soldiers, their church destroyed, their savings confiscated. While he had been away, he learned, France had revoked its toleration of Protestants. He was lucky to be able to sneak aboard a ship and sail away to freedom in the New World. Two of Jay's other grandparents similarly had to flee anti-Protestant persecution, one from Paris and one from Bohemia. Jay's son and biographer tells us this proudly. It was a living family tradition. As Edmund Burke warned his fellow members of Parliament 4 weeks before Lexington and Concord, when it was already too late, all Protestantism is a sort of dissent, but American Protestantism is a refinement on the principle of resistance. It is the dissidence of dissent and the Protestantism of the Protestant religion. Whatever might be the differences among the American Protestant sects, they all agree, he said, in the communion of the spirit of liberty. So don't push them. Long before Emma Lazarus wrote about the huddled masses yearning to breathe free, George Washington noted that for the poor, the needy, and the oppressed of the earth, America was already what he called the second land of promise, the promised land. It offered said James Madison, an asylum to the persecuted and oppressed of every nation and religion. In fact, for Madison, trained at Princeton by a radical Scottish-born Presbyterian minister, John Witherspoon, it was red-hot outrage over a remnant of religious oppression in the New World that drove him into a political career. Virginia, where Anglicanism was still the official established religion until the Revolution, had jailed a group of Baptist preachers for their unorthodox religious writings. Virginia had put them in jail. If you aren't free to think your own thoughts and believe your own beliefs, fumed Madison, you aren't free, period, since freedom is seamless. And as a practical matter, there can be no progress without intellectual freedom. So when the 25-year-old revolutionary took part in drafting Virginia's Declaration of Rights, he rejected its original provision for religious toleration. It's not government's business to tolerate somebody's belief or not. You are unconditionally free to think whatever your reason convinces you is true, government or no government. And that's what the Declaration of Rights ended up saying. Madison would never use Thomas Jefferson's high-flown language, but he would certainly agree with his friend's sentiment that I have sworn upon the altar of God eternal hostility to every form of tyranny over the mind of man. They knew what it meant to individuals and to a whole culture to have to parrot an official orthodoxy or else shut up. And they knew what further physical tyrannies such unfreedom of belief could unleash. That's a truth worth recalling right now. The founders' conception of liberty also included economic freedom, inseparable from their Lockean political philosophy. William Livingston was among the first of those who diffused that philosophy throughout the colonies, and Madison and his fellow Princetonians were still quoting him 20 years later. Men were born free and equal into the state of nature, endowed with rights that come from nature prior to all political institution, Livingston wrote. But because human nature is what it is, because the inborn depravity of mankind gives individuals a tendency to invade the person or fortune of their neighbors, the weak were a perpetual prey to the powerful in the state of nature. To preserve to every individual the undisturbed enjoyment of his acquisitions and the security of his person, Livingston wrote, men entered into society and appointed magistrates, arming them with the total power of the community to protect everybody's safety and property. Such was the origin of government. That means that rulers work for the citizens, not vice versa. As Jefferson later put it, kings are the servants, not the proprietors of the people. And like any public servants, except today's unionized ones, they can be fired. That also means that public servants are charged with a very specific, limited task. They can't shirk it, and they can't use the power that citizens have given them for any other purpose. The money that pays them comes from the property that they are hired to protect. That's why, as Livingston explained, any tax ought to be considered as the voluntary gift of the people to be applied to such uses as they, by their representatives, shall think expedient. The founding fathers meant it literally, therefore, when they said taxation without representation is tyranny. It wasn't a metaphor when George Washington called the stamp tax and the tea tax the most grievous and intolerable species of tyranny and oppression that was ever inflicted upon mankind. Continental Congressman Richard Henry Lee didn't think he was being overwrought in comparing the taxes to Egyptian bondage. In addition to their Lockean political philosophy, the founders had concrete historical reasons for their outrage over taxation without their consent. After all, their ancestors had planted a civilization in the New World wilderness on their own initiative and by their own efforts. They did build that. America's settlements, Jefferson wrote, were firmly established at the expense of individuals and not the British public. Not a shilling was ever issued from the public treasuries of His Majesty or his ancestors for their assistance until very late times. In addition, wrote Richard Henry Lee, the Crown, knowing what great benefit it would be to England to settle this country, and what great dangers the first settlers must meet with, did give them a charter that they and their children and all who came after them should hold their liberty and property as the people of England did. So their liberty and property have the additional protection of the British Constitution, which the colonists saw as guaranteeing that no man may be taxed but with his own consent. Only their own representatives in their own frugal colonial assemblies, not members of a parliament 3,000 miles away, could give consent to tax the wealth that Americans had created by their own enterprise. Thus, that this wealth had enriched Britain through extensive transatlantic trade was a huge benefit to England. Surely, Lee wrote, it can hardly be just to the benefited to repay their benefactors with chains instead of the most grateful acknowledgement. Having forged such prosperity out of wilderness, the founders had a positive, optimistic vision of what economic liberty could achieve. It was a vision that George Washington nicely articulated. The spirit of commerce, he said, lies at the very heart of America's national character. How could it not be, given that the country's first settlers were self-reliant, enterprising risk takers even before they arrived? They had crossed the ocean seeking to live on their own terms and to make their own fortunes, and they created a culture of free enterprise that Washington believed should be vigorously nurtured. Though a slave-owning Virginia planter, he was also a big-thinking, risk-taking entrepreneur. He built a grist mill and a distillery, which became America's biggest. He set up a fishery that exported internationally, and he speculated so successfully in land that he became one of the country's richest men. He had no patience with Jefferson's sentimentality about farming's moral superiority to manufacturing and finance. He had thought past mercantilism before the revolution ended. Yes, he remarked, Spain has rich colonial silver mines, but the truth is that commerce and industry are the best mines of a nation. He was a prime mover of a Potomac Canal to serve as a highway for the trade of the Ohio country, and the conference he arranged at Mount Vernon for representatives of Virginia and Maryland to plan the canal that led to the 1786 Annapolis Convention, that in turn set up the Constitutional Convention the next year. His vision of America as a land of promise with milk and honey was a vision of opportunity for all. As president, he fully backed Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton's financial program for fostering the entrepreneurial spirit and turning his dream of a land of plenty into a reality. Those measures, the funding of the national debt, the creation of the bank and the mint, were the key accomplishments after the Bill of Rights of Washington's first term. As important as Hamilton's economic vision was, though, the moral one that was inseparable from it was even more so. Why is it vital to have a highly developed, highly diversified economy? He asked in his report on manufactures. The object is not just the production of more goods and services, but of human fulfillment in thinking them up and creating them. So, while a more ample and various field of enterprise will certainly increase the wealth of the nation, it will also allow all the diversity of talents and dispositions which discriminate men from each other to develop to their fullest excellence, In a society with limited opportunity, he wrote, minds of the strongest and most active powers for their proper objects labor without effect if confined to uncongenial pursuits. But when all the different kinds of industry obtain in a community, each individual can find his proper element and can call into activity the whole vigor of his nature. To Hamilton, economics was soulcraft. As he put it, to cherish and stimulate the activity of the human mind by multiplying the objects of enterprise is not among the least considerable of the expedients by which the wealth of a nation may be promoted. To nurture human talent and realize human potential, has free enterprise ever had a more magnificent and profound defense? And when he came to set up the mint, Hamilton took care to issue coins of the smallest denominations so that the humblest Americans could participate in the opportunity economy that this self-made immigrant framed. It is a grim paradox that the founders also valued liberty so highly because they lived amidst slavery. Even the slave owners among them knew how obscenely unjust the institution was. The whole commerce between master and slave, wrote Jefferson, is a perpetual exercise of the most boisterous passions, the most unremitting despotism on the one part, and degrading submissions on the other. I needn't detail the toil, the punishments, the sexual exploitation, the breakup of families, the enforced ignorance, and the regulation of every aspect of life comprehended in Jefferson's decorous statement of the inhumanity of which human nature is capable. In 1759, more than a century before the Civil War, Richard Henry Lee of Stratford Hall, later president of the Continental Congress, and a cousin of Stratford-born Robert E. Lee, made his maiden speech in the Virginia House of Burgesses. His message to his fellow slave owners: end slavery. How can anyone who calls himself a Christian, he demanded, think that our fellow creatures are no longer to be considered as created in the image of God as well as ourselves, and equally entitled to liberty and freedom by the great law of nature? Jefferson, who had written that all men are created equal, wrote in words that prefigure Lincoln's second inaugural, "When the measure of their tears shall be full, when their groans shall have involved heaven itself in darkness, doubtless a God of justice will awaken to their distress, and by diffusing light and liberality among their oppressors, or at length by his exterminating thunder, manifest his attention to the things of this world, and that they are not to be left to the guidance of a blind fatality." So, when the young and pig-headed King George III began meddling in American affairs, after decades of Britain's official policy of salutary neglect toward its New World colonies, the founders had a ready explanation for his intentions. The king, concluded Washington in 1774, aimed to make us as tame and abject slaves as the blacks we rule over with such arbitrary sway. A sentiment whose full implications it took the general a lifetime to grasp before he freed his slaves on his deathbed. Even earlier, Richard Henry Lee's brother Arthur, who became one of the Revolution's foreign agents, declared, "I cannot conceive of the necessity of becoming a slave while there remains a ditch in which one may die free. For such men, to repeat, liberty wasn't just a word. Choosing your beliefs, your thoughts, your job, your officials, your laws, your taxes, being equal citizens before a law that was the same for all. How could they take these freedoms for granted?" Government, the founders recognized, is a double-edged sword. You arm officials with the power to protect you, but those officials have the same fallen human nature as everyone else. So who is to say that they won't use that power to oppress you, as European governments had oppressed the colonists' forebears? Even the democratic republic the founders were creating had to be run by imperfect men, and thus even it could turn into what Richard Henry Lee called an elective despotism. So the second great founding idea is this: the mere fact that you elect representatives to govern you is no guarantee of liberty. This danger worried the founders constantly, and they struggled to protect their new government from it. Their first experiment was to make that government too weak to oppress them, but it was also too weak to do its chief job of protecting them, they found. The war against British tyranny proved longer and harder than it needed to be, since the central government lacked authority to tax, to pay soldiers, to buy arms. With scanty funds, Washington's army starved and froze through the nightmare winters at Valley Forge, at Middlebrook, at Morristown. To see men without clothes to cover their nakedness, Washington wrote, without blankets to lay on, without shoes by which their marches might be traced from the blood from their feet, and almost as often without provisions as with, marching through frost and snow, is a mark of patience and obedience, which in my opinion can scarce be paralleled. That they won the war was a miracle. Still, when the founders set out to write a new constitution to give the federal government powers sufficient to its purpose, they did so with their hearts in their mouths. They strictly limited those powers to what they deemed absolutely essential, and they carefully spelled out what they were. They divided and subdivided power and made each branch of government a check on the others to guard against overreaching. They set frequent elections and gave the president a veto and made him and other officials subject to impeachment. No one was more alive to the danger of democratic despotism than Madison. If an elected majority tramples rights to life, liberty, or property given individuals by nature or God, it is still despotism. In the most famous of the Federalist Papers, number 10, Madison confronts the idea that, hold on, taxation with representation can be tyranny. Those who hold and those who are without property have ever formed distinct interests in society, he writes. Those who are creditors and those who are debtors fall under a like discrimination. A landed interest, a manufacturing interest, a mercantile interest, a moneyed interest grow up of necessity in civilized nations and divide them into different classes. The regulation of these differing interests forms the principal task of modern legislation. The heart of that task is taxation. The apportionment of taxes on the various descriptions of property, Madison wrote, is an act which seems to require the most exact impartiality, yet there is perhaps no legislative act in which greater opportunity and temptation are given to a predominant party to trample on the rules of justice. Every shilling with which they overburden the inferior number is a shilling saved to their own pockets. And you can't count on enlightened statesmen or morality or religion to prevent such injustice. They won't. Nor is unjust taxation the only improper or wicked project a democratic majority might cook up to trample the property rights of the richer minority, Madison acknowledged. There could also be, he wrote, a rage for paper money, for an abolition of debts, for an equal division of property. America had seen all of these as either a threat or a reality since the revolution began. During the war, as Congress printed paper currency backed by nothing, inflation had soared. $1 of gold or silver bought 8 paper dollars at the start of 1779, 42 by year's end. By then, George Washington wrote, a wagon load of money will scarcely purchase a wagon load of provision. The general was all too aware that such inflation meant a huge transfer of wealth from creditors to debtors. Someone who long ago had bought 600 acres from him in the most valuable part of Virginia that ought to have been paid before the money began to depreciate, nay, years before the war, he complained, wanted to pay the debt in 1779 in paper money then worth no more than a year's salary for a common miller. Though fearful of injuring by any example of mine the credit of our paper currency, Washington also feared that to accept the deal is not serving the public, but countenancing dishonesty. As for the abolition of debts and the equal division of property, a year before the Constitutional Convention, an uprising called Shays's Rebellion gave the founders an ominous glimpse of the property rights invasions citizens could plot. Thousands of depression-squeezed, pitchfork-armed young farmers in Western Massachusetts had tried to hijack guns from the Springfield Armory to force the courts to close before judges could seize their farms for tax delinquency or let their creditors foreclose. Secretary of War Henry Knox wrote Washington that the rebels' creed is that the property of the United States has been protected from confiscation of Britain by the joint exertions of all, and therefore ought to be the common property of all, Washington reported to Madison in a letter bristling with incredulous underlinings. Further, Knox had written him, they are determined to annihilate all debts, public and private. In that case, Washington demanded in his letter to Madison, what security has a man to life, liberty, or property? Madison was just as aghast as Washington at the claim that the revolution should bring about égalité, beyond the equality of rights and equality before the law. The founders aimed only for liberté. In fact, Madison insisted in Federalist 10, if you want liberty to pursue your own happiness in your own way, as Americans do, you are bound to have inequality since people have different abilities and tastes. From the protection of different and unequal faculties of acquiring property, he wrote, the possession of different degrees and kinds of property immediately results. So the whole constitutional machinery of which he was the chief architect, the extensive republic comprising lots of competing and mutually opposing interests, the strictly limited enumerated powers, the checks and balances of branch against branch and legislative house against legislative house, all aim to ensure that a government with the power to tax enough to fight wars effectively wouldn't be so strong that it would threaten the liberty and property that it was instituted to protect. One of the main purposes of the Constitution, in other words, is to ensure that the unpropertied majority won't confiscate by unjust taxation or any other means the possessions of the propertied minority. That is what he meant by the tyranny of the majority. As the Constitution's chief designer, Madison constructed his exquisitely balanced mechanism to work by the power of ambition countering ambition and interest countering interest. A realist about human nature, he devised a government for ordinary men as they really were, not for prodigies of virtue. Perhaps because the founders recognized that they had to work within the limits of human nature, not to change it, their revolution was the only great one that succeeded. Still, Madison conceded, there had to be at least a smidgen of virtue somewhere. If there is not sufficient virtue among men for self-government, he wrote, then only the chains of despotism can restrain them from destroying and devouring each other. Washington was even more explicit about this, the third of the great founding ideas, A democratic republic requires a special kind of culture, one that nurtures self-reliance and a love of liberty. Constitutions are all very well, the founders often observed, but they are only parchment barriers, easily breached if demagogues subvert the spirit and letter of the document. They can do this dramatically in one revolutionary putsch, or they can inflict a death by 1,000 cuts, gradually persuading citizens that the Constitution doesn't mean what it says, but should be interpreted to mean something different, even something opposite. The ultimate safeguard against such usurpation is the vitality of America's culture of liberty. In his first State of the Union speech, Washington stressed this point, emphasizing a view universal among the founders. The security of a free constitution, he said, depends on teaching the people themselves to know and to value their own rights, to discern and to provide against invasions of them, to distinguish between oppression and the necessary exercise of lawful authority, to discriminate the spirit of liberty from that of licentiousness, and to unite a speedy but temperate vigilance against encroachments with an inviolable respect for the laws. If citizens start to take liberty for granted, if their culture, molded by journalists and writers, preachers and teachers, starts to hold other values in higher esteem, then the spirit that gives life to the Constitution will flicker out. Americans, Washington advised, should guard against listlessness for the preservation of natural and unalienable rights, for no mound of parchment can be so formed as to stand against the sweeping torrent of boundless ambition on the one side, aided by the sapping current of corrupted morals on the other. The founders well understood, as John Adams once said, that it was a change in the principles, opinions, sentiments, and affections of Americans that had sparked the revolution. They considered the culture of freedom that burned ever more brightly among them, along with the new Constitution they created, to be a precious inheritance bequeathed to future generations of their fellow citizens. That exceptional vision, I thought in writing this book, and think even more strongly today, is an instructive standard by which to gauge the present. I thank you very kindly and wish you a most happy Constitution Day.
Myron, that was a fabulous way to celebrate Constitution Day. The floor is now open for anybody who has a question. If there are such questions to be asked or entertained. I noticed that one person, Myron, said, boy, that point on taxation without representation was spot on. So well said for today's society, but in the context of 233 years ago. Any comment on his comment of how it's just as germane today as it was then? Where do you think we are in that respect?
Are you asking me that, Dan?
Yeah, just a short answer.
I'm really happy to answer that. I mean, look, I think that the New Deal and the Great Society were not realizations of the founders' vision, they were repudiations of it. And, you know, in the latest book I wrote, Clarence Thomas and the Lost Constitution, I argued that we're really living under two constitutions now, and some of the bitterness that characterizes our politics right now is that people like me think we're living under the constitution that we're celebrating today. Others believe that we're living under the living constitution as announced by Woodrow Wilson, who despised the founders, despised the framers as these passé figures, not modern, not illuminated by social science. And he wanted the Supreme Court to sit as a permanent constitutional convention, making up the government, making up the Constitution as it went along. So when Franklin Roosevelt supersized that idea in the New Deal, and the Supreme Court kept batting down one New Deal program after another, and FDR threatened to pack the court. Supreme Court backed down and said, okay, fine, do whatever you want. And so we ended up with a government that was all about redistribution, not about liberty, not about the protection of life, liberty, and property. So we've come an awful long way in that 233 years.
Mm-hmm. One of our participants has asked a question that's certainly good for this environment in which you've presented your lecture. It's really a very simple question, and I'm not sure it has an easy answer. How do we teach our young people today the lesson of the dangers of democracy being reduced?
Well, I mean, that's what I tried to do in this talk. You know, you have to start
in a situation was fighting for his life.
Right. Why not start by noticing what it was that the founders were actually trying to do and how magnificent it was? I mean, this is an unexampled vision of human liberty and the possibilities of human fulfillment. Start there. Start by looking at what our history is. Be absolutely upfront and frank about the ways in which we developed, the ways in which, I mean, look at, we could not have been static from where the founders left us. The founders, such as Jefferson, believed that enlightenment would get rid of slavery. It was exterminating thunder that did it. It cost nearly 400,000 Union lives to make men free. You know, and then we had to have the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments, and then the 19th Amendment to give women the vote. And so it took a while to perfect our Constitution, and then it took a while to hinder it. And I think that what people need to do is study our history, understand what makes us exceptional, and not just do what's happening today, which is go around and tear everything down and say, I mean, can you imagine people tore down a statue of George Washington just recently? And people even tore down a statue of Ulysses S. Grant, who won the Civil War to set the slaves free. I mean, what can you do with invincible ignorance like that? We have to teach them. And I think that it is incumbent on young people to learn the lessons that history has to teach.
So another question, somebody said, so how do we think about or handle a situation of, let's say, Puerto Rico? And I'll expand the question just slightly to include Washington, D.C., where it says, in other words, how do we look at these when Puerto Rico does not have representation in regard to taxation, as you suggest, and or that those who live in Washington, D.C. Also don't have participation in representative government? What do you say to that questioner?
Well, I think that, I mean, I was all in favor of Puerto Rican independence. When that movement was afoot, I don't think that our colonies were a good idea. And I am not in favor of Puerto Rican statehood. I would be perfectly happy for Puerto Rican independence. As for independence for Washington, that was the deal that was made in order to get the Constitution ratified. The deal was that we would carve out this area from Virginia and Maryland to make it the federal city, whose principal business would be government, which, by the way, it is. And it is governed directly, supposed to be governed directly by the Congress. Where we got a municipal government of Washington is not clear to me. Where we got a mayor of Washington, D.C. is not clear to me, but fine. That's an additional layer of representation that the citizens of Washington have, but their most direct ability is their ability to vote for a president who runs their city and a Congress which assists in doing it.
Is there ever a compelling reason for government to actually suspend constitutional liberties?
Well, the only time that it happened was when Lincoln suspended habeas corpus during the Civil War. Well, that was a time when people were actually making war on the United States. And so that was a time when those liberties got suspended. But the only other time that I can think of was the Alien and Sedition Act passed under President Madison in 1798. And I've just been reading the letters under President Adams in 1798. And I've just been reading the letters that Adams and Jefferson were writing back and forth to each other frequently when they were old men. And Adams said, gee, I really wish I hadn't done that. He recognized in old age that it was a terrible mistake. No, it is never okay to suspend constitutional liberties. Never okay.
So here's a somewhat confrontational question, I would say.
I'm happy for confrontation. This is the time for it, Dan.
Here you go. So what are your thoughts on how closely intertwined the Constitution is with colonialism, oppression, mass genocide, and racism?
Not at all. All the, colonialism, mass genocide, no. The Constitution had nothing to do with that. Now, racism, this is a very vexed question. And I think that Lincoln had it right. Lincoln said in his eulogy for Henry Clay that the founders came to the institution of slavery not as something that they created, but something that had existed for 100 years already, that started by accident when a slave ship ran aground off the coast of Virginia. It subsisted for 100 years, and they did not know readily how to get rid of it, said Lincoln, without injury to liberty itself. That is, they couldn't get the Constitution ratified by all 13 colonies if they were going to get rid of slavery in one fell swoop, which all the Northerners wanted to do. So they figured that it would die out of its own accord. They did what they could do, Lincoln says. They passed the Northwest Ordinance even before the Constitution in order to prevent the spread of slavery. They put a year when the slave trade was going to end. Already, Southerners, Virginians like Washington and Jefferson thought that the exhaustion of the soil of Virginia was going to make slavery economically unviable. So They thought that it would die out. They believed in enlightenment. It didn't. We actually fought a civil war to abolish slavery. And we passed those 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to make our Black fellow citizens full citizens with equal rights. Now, it takes us very far afield because one of the things I wanted to know in writing Clarence Thomas and the Lost Constitution is what happened to the 14th Amendment? What happened to the privileges or immunities clause of the 14th Amendment that gave full civil rights to our Black fellow citizens? And the terrible answer is that it was the Supreme Court in the 1870s that watered down the 14th Amendment. And so we've had to have an awful lot of dancing around. And by the way, it was the Supreme Court that permitted the Southern states to introduce Jim Crow. And so we had to overcome that. Now look, Dan, I entered college in 1962. So my whole sort of conscious life has been the civil rights movement and its working out. And what I have seen is a nation that has turned itself inside out to try to expunge the stain of slavery and racism. And I would say that we have done as much and more as we can do, and that we really have now created an opportunity society in which the door is open to anybody who wishes to walk through it. And more than that, we cannot do.
So I think this will be the final question, and that is, of the times is complicated. Trilling used that word a lot, apparently, complicated. So at the time of the founding, as you've described, our founding fathers had severe disagreements about how to proceed, yet somehow were able to do so with a certain amount, I say certain amount, of civility and respect for each other. It seems that we are in a time now where that is, again, terribly problematic for us just to talk civilly about these issues. Is there anything that we can learn about how the founders handled conversation in our own time?
You know, they did violently disagree about many things with each other. But they said at the beginning of the Constitution, of the Constitutional Convention, that they had come to consult, to confer, to compromise, not to argue. And I think that what we have to learn, and I mean, this is what your university is all about. We have to learn that we all have reason. It is fallible. There are other sides and other sides and other sides that we need to come together and discuss with each other in goodwill, holding as much as we can certain truths to be self-evident, because who can prove scientifically, who can show us the science, right, that all men are created equal? We believe it. We believe that all men are created equal and endowed with equal rights. And after that, we can discuss the ways in which we can make that vision the fullest reality for everybody. But we need to learn, and that's the word that you used, Dan, that I think is so important, and that Lionel Trilling would also have been happy to embrace: civility. The art of living in a city, in a polity. And I think that this is what a university education is all about: to come together in one place, to learn the best that has been thought and said, to consider the various points of view, to discuss among ourselves in a spirit of comity, and to learn that nobody has the final answer to anything, and we must make a common life together that gives us as much security and freedom as it is possible to have. And this is a thing that our Constitution has enabled us to do. Thank you, Dan. Thank you to all your colleagues. Thank you to all your wonderful students. It has been a pleasure to share Constitution Day with you.
Agreed. Thank you very much. This has been a wonderful presentation and dialogue. And even though we didn't plan this, it happens that all of us can participate in art and music, and maybe not argue as we do so much about politics. It seems to me there are realms where we don't have to argue quite as much. So we are going to listen to Philip Glass' piece as we finish. And anybody who wants to listen can listen one more time, because, by the way, any musical or artistic object is best when it's perceived at least 2 or 3 times, as it reveals its beauties to us. So I will thank everyone for being here. Know that this is the first in a series. You will be able to find out much more about what will follow in the Voices of Culture lecture series by going to the website for American Culture and Ideas. We will have it up very shortly. And that website is ACII, American Culture and Ideas, .arizona.edu. You can also get there by going to the website for the Center for the Philosophy of Freedom, of which this lecture series is also a part. And here is the Grove String Quartet playing Mishima by Philip Glass. And then good night to all.